So welcome everybody to the 5th event in the Public Thought Leadership Series hosted by Western Sydney University Library. The Thought Leadership event series, spearheaded by our Deputy Vice-Chancellor Simon Barry, aims to celebrate Western Sydney University's #1 ranking in the Times Higher Education Index, which assesses universities against United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. The event series aims to celebrate and promote this #1 ranking, complementing work being done across the university as part of its decadal strategy. Just so you know, all participants are on mute at the moment, but we'll be unmuting you at the end for questions. Also letting you know that this Zoom meeting is being recorded, so participation in the chat and question and answer, you will just do that knowing that your responses will be recorded, but it is purely optional. Also, I'd like to acknowledge country. With respect for Aboriginal cultural protocol and out of recognition that our organisation occupied their traditional lands, Western Sydney University would like to acknowledge the Darug, Darawal, also referred to as Tharawal, Gundungurra and Wiradjuri peoples, and thanks for them for their support of our work in their lands in Greater Western Sydney and beyond.
So let me introduce Associate Professor Jessica Weir for this presentation. And today's topic is, what did Australia learn about country after the 2019-2020 catastrophic bushfires? Jessica Weir works with Western Sydney University and at the Institute for Culture and Society. Jessica investigates human-environment relations, expert evidence, justice, and public sector governance, building on 20 years of public-private community sector work. Jessica's research practice seeks to relocate humans within their environments and within cultural and ethical domains, including investigating the use and utility of expert knowledge about facts and values. This presentation considers what the catastrophic bushfire inquiries tell us about where the Federation of Australia is at with learning about country. Jessica will demonstrate how diverging and aligning Indigenous and non-Indigenous bushfire expertise offers more possibilities for responding to global environmental crisis, understanding expert knowledge, and invites discussion from audience. Welcome, Jessica.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for the acknowledgement of country. I too would like to acknowledge country. This country is out in the far west of New South Wales. It's floodplain country, it's river country. These places got names given by the early colonialists, like the Garden of Eden, and here they are dried out because the rivers have been so regulated. And I just want to acknowledge that I want to acknowledge all the mentors I've had. I've listed them there, but most importantly were the traditional owners from along the Murray River who taught me that my PhD was going to be about water rights, and they taught me there's no rights from a dead river, and started me on a really big journey, which I'm sharing with you today, about learning about country. And this I do as a non-Indigenous person, and I thank all my Indigenous colleagues again for mentoring me around how to step back, step up, and walk alongside as an ally. So let's get stuck into it. It's a bit of a cheeky title for today. So what did Australia learn about country after the fires? And just to let you know, by Australia, in this talk, I mean the parliaments, the jurisdictions, like the state and territory governments, the federal government, and so on. And I will be scoping in just to have a look at the bushfire inquiries that responded to the catastrophic fires. And country, what is country? Well, I'm still learning, and every time I learn more, I realise there's another layer, and so on and so forth. This image here was shared on Facebook by Lydia Thorpe with the meme, "I was not born in Australia, Australia was born on my country." And so that's just emphasising the political legal presence of Indigenous law and governance. And then on the left, there's a picture of a painting of the Murray River, or Dangala in Yori Yori language, by Indigenous artist Tom Day, expressing how country is a combination of everything, you know, law, river, language, food, economy, and so on. It's all connected, and the focus is on relationships, what's important and why. And we've got Indigenous scholars also writing about this, and Lauren Tynan has written that country encompasses everything from ants, memories, humans, fire, and tides, and research. And so she writes about country as territory, but also as a agential force, you know, and that means it has agency, powerful agency, and also the connective web of law and knowledge. And these, I will be returning to this throughout the talk, and learning more about country as we go along, myself included. And these and the implications for knowledge and power. So let's have a look at here are some images from the spring-summer catastrophic fires, actually mega fires that punched up not just into the atmosphere, but into the stratosphere. And there were 38 of these plume events over a 5-day period within that 5 months, over New Year's Eve, which I'm sure you all remember. It was really shocking. And part of what was happening at that time was there was a huge interest in Indigenous people's fire management, and headlines went around the world, you know, how Australia's Indigenous experts could help, and, you know, look what's going on in the Northern Territory kind of thing. And then here, because the cultural burns are also conducted around Australia, someone had their house saved. And so this is a photo of a cultural burn in New South Wales, down on the south coast. And it gives a small idea about what is this expertise that all these headlines were interested in. You know, what can cultural burning offer? And you can see it's a low, small fires here. And Indigenous people speak at length about how it's about practicing relationships with country that have been passed down the generations between specific people and specific places, as also learnt and taught across the continent. And I was involved in a team where we put together some cultural burning stories in a short book that's online. And this is Eileen Albert's story. She's a Gilgal Gunditj elder from the Gunditj Mara Nation in southwest Victoria and eastern South Australia. So if you know Portland. And Gunditj Mara talk about how they've always burnt their country. And one very important part of burning their country is to make sure strong grasses grow for weaving the fish traps to catch the eels. as part of their extensive eel aquaculture traditions. And another story was by Vanessa Kavanagh. She's a Bundjalung and Woonera woman. And in this picture here, you can see her daughter lighting a fire. That's actually her daughter Emma at 9 years old, lighting a fire on her grandfather's country, lighting a cultural burn. And Vanessa reflects on how extraordinary that is for her daughter to experience that. Now I'm just going to play a little bit of audio here from Vanessa so we can hear directly from her about cultural burning.
Or what women were doing either. But if you look at the history books, I think it's the colonial explorer Sir Thomas Mitchell, he talks about in his diaries witnessing Aboriginal women and children burning the grasslands in areas which are now part of New South Wales. So there are records as well of Aboriginal women participating in burning. Again, looking back at those early historical records, they started talking about putting out fires and, fire suppression really early on after invasion. And, and that part of that was because Aboriginal people were using it as a guerrilla tactic and burning the crops and burning the houses of the settlers. There is a fear around fire. Whereas when, if I talk to my mum about fire, she said, fire is comforting. Fire is, it's about warmth and light and, the fire within your belly, the fire within your spirit. It's a positive thing. It's not a fearful thing. So when
and so you're starting to get an idea from Vanessa there of really different attitude towards fire. So then what happened in the firestorm? Well, Indigenous, I've got some statistics here, which it's another form of, telling stories about the world. And these are based on population data. That shows that there were 84,000 people in the fire-affected areas, just looking at New South Wales and Victoria, Aboriginal people, which is 25% of the population. These are really Indigenous areas with really distinct population profiles and significant rights recognised by Australia, the Federation of Australia, over country. And Indigenous leaders spoke out at the time, and I thought Lorena was extraordinary when she said, like you, I've watched in anguish and horror. But for First Nations people, it is also burning up our memories, our sacred places, all the things which make us who we are. And so she's identifying there the unique relationships with country that Indigenous peoples hold as First Nations. And then Amy here is talking about, is angry about the current situation being a result of colonisation. And that's a picture of Vanessa at the top and a picture of Bruce Pascoe at the bottom. Now this is a audio from before the catastrophic bushfires, but it really succinctly explains what people are talking about when they're talking about cultural burning. Because what I've been leading up to is, you can talk about cultural burning as a discrete fire practice. And that's what those global headlines were, kind of saying, oh, what is this cool burning technique? Look how it can reduce fuel loads. But actually, Indigenous people are talking about country. They're talking about cultural burning as part of country, as part of knowing fire differently, and as part of being responsible to country. And I'll just go over here to hear from Victor here, and I've got two different clips.
What do you do? How is what you do different to the way the rest of the firefighting community operates?
It's totally opposite to what everyone's doing here. Like everyone's talking about the aftermath. and it's always the way Western, society works is really based on the aftermath of things and always acting when things are too late. Whereas all the work that I do is in the prevention of that, and it's really about putting fires in, not to save your house, just your house, but to save the bushlands, look after the environment as a whole, and above all, teach people what they should know about the country in terms of understanding fire properly.
So that's the first clip. And now this is the one which I rely on heavily in this talk.
That's right. That is the primary thing that we need to be doing, is protecting the environment, because we can't keep doing what we're doing. We can't continue to sit back and watch hundreds of kilometres of land being annihilated and yet just sit down and just think about ourselves. But in due respect, we need to be looking after our residents, and we need to be looking after our houses. But what's the point of doing that if we're not looking after the land?
What's the point of looking after the houses if we're not looking after the land? And I will return to that later. So what is at hand? Indigenous people are saying that that it's the land that's at hand, or country, and also what is being done. And this is a photo from the 2009 Victorian Bushfire Royal Commission, which was very extensive, 4-volume report, and Indigenous people were only included as an historical footnote in this 2009 report, although there was a passing mention about cultural heritage. Similarly with the Canberra 2009 inquiry report. So these inquiries are meant to be a moment when all evidence is brought together to respond to what's important. And you can see that the real absence of Indigenous people in these inquiry processes is a real statement on the establishment of the Federation of Australia in a way that sought to, well, not just sought to marginalise Indigenous peoples and country, but actually relied upon the absence of pre-existing political legal entities. But what happened after the most recent fires, and what this talk is reporting on, is how things are shifting, things are changing, and we can see a really big difference 10 years later with the fires. So I can only guess that the reason why Indigenous people were treated as a historical footnote in these inquiry processes is that they were not in the room, and so they were not able to give evidence and be involved in decision making in these processes. But that changed with the most recent ones. So the most recent catastrophic fires, Australian society had changed to recognise Indigenous presence. And this was reflected in terms of reference, which looked at whether traditional land and fire management practices could improve Australia's resilience to natural disasters. This one's the Royal Commission, which was run by the federal government, which was requested by the federal government. And that's kind of it's got broad issues. The recommendations are that there should be engagement with traditional owners, who are the first people of country, and to leverage insights for public land management. And there's a whole chapter actually on Indigenous land and fire management, so it's quite different. And by collecting the evidence, the inquiry has documented a whole heap of different new information, including not just around land management, but also around Indigenous organisations in emergency planning, the role of Indigenous community radio, and then the cultural heritage values. As before, they're still there. Significantly, this inquiry acknowledges that cultural burning is more than just a discrete practice. It's a way of land management that is much broader than hazard reduction, than addressing bushfires. And that's what my talk is about today. And I just note that they did unfortunately categorise Indigenous communal land titles as private property when they are a very distinct Indigenous form of property. The second one I looked at was the New South Wales bushfire inquiry. Again, we have similar terms of reference here to be looking at Indigenous practices. Again, here in the recommendations, they've actually said, again, cultural burning it's not just simply another fire technique. And so in this report, there was actually a lot of concern about co-option, that the government would just start doing these cool burns. And so this kind of language was about respecting Indigenous authority on country to practice Indigenous fire burning, Indigenous landscape burning. And also, again, in this one, they've now also picked up emergency management planning and evacuation issues. But yeah, the inquiry report was a finer scale one because the federal government doesn't really have that much territory, whereas the New South Wales government had significant territory and bushfire management responsibilities. And again, by having Indigenous people giving evidence, there's new content in this inquiry. And the Victorian situation is a bit different. So after the 2009 Black Saturday fires, they set up the Inspector General for Emergency Management. So there was an institution there that then could run this inquiry. Again, it had that similar terms of reference about traditional fire approaches, but this one also acknowledged there was ecological and cultural values present. And it also created an institution, Bushfire Recovery Victoria, which is now called Emergency Recovery Victoria. For the first time ever in Australia, it dedicated a line of inquiry and funding into Aboriginal culture and wellbeing. And and there was a chapter on Aboriginal healing and culture and recognising the close relationship between Aboriginal people and their country and the various traumas experienced by Aboriginal people because of colonisation and because of bushfires. So in summary, there's been changes to content and process. You know, it's gone from a complete absence. The paper I showed before with the statistics, that's the first paper of any kind written about Indigenous people's experiences with any kind of natural hazard across temperate Australia. I mean, so there's an absence of evidence in the research sector. But this is changing rapidly. So there's a recognition of different viewpoints, different experiences, and now there's an awkward positioning in relation to nature and ecology. And I'm coming to that. And I note that in Victoria, they're in a bit of a different headspace, and that's not surprising given that they have gone down a path of making treaties with the Indigenous people in that state. And I acknowledge here my colleague and friend, Dean Freeman, to the left there. He was planning to be here today. I'm not sure if he can, if he made it, but I just shout out to him. And so I would just want to return to what is at hand. And you remember that Victor said, what's the point of looking after the houses if we're not looking after the land? And this is the logics of country, which foregrounds the land first. And then that's not to say that houses are not important, but that they are looked after as part of looking after country. And in this slide here, what I've shown is on the bottom, you can see the argument that Victor is making that's aligning with the logics of country. You look after country, and then people and buildings are looked after as part of that because they are within country. So if you're attuned to fire in the landscape and factors affecting fire risk, the presence of fire, then you will be at the same time looking after people and buildings. Whereas the the system that the Australian Federation has, that Australia has, is very clearly that the first thing to look after is people. The second thing to look after is then the buildings, so the houses and infrastructure. And then the third thing is the environment. And then that's kind of might be, for example, an ecological community that's really valued, or an area where there's an endangered species. And so it's a very different viewpoint. And this is the message that Indigenous people are trying to get across over and over again for generations about country. And it won't be heard if cultural burning is considered just a simple fire technique, although that's definitely has been heard in the inquiry processes. But the other thing is it's not being heard because we've got a really big idea happening here, and that's the environment. And so I've got these little people walking along the bottom here because I'm taking you on a journey here. You know, we're talking about thought leadership in this series, and that's about how we think, not just what we think in the humanities. And from my academic tradition, we look at the power of meaning and assumption behind words. You know, so Victor's using the word the environment, you know, and he's talking about the land, he's talking about country, but he I presume, is speaking from the traditions of country, whereby the people and the houses are within the environment. Whereas what I was taught as a non-Indigenous person in my geography studies at university, and including the science courses I took, was this idea of an environment that's separate to humans. And it's a really recent idea. It came about in the 20th century, and it emerged with the evolution of the environmental sciences. So, it was this part of the scientific revolution, which has been so extraordinary, is to study and observe nature. And through that methodology, it came to be an understanding of nature as separate to humanity. And it's the problem is that it's become so influential that it's presumed out there, you know, that it's no longer an idea that developed in the 20th century. It's a reality that does not even need examining. It is what it is. This is the environment, you know, and we know, you know, its habitat, its biodiversity, its wildlife, and so on and so forth. Whereas Indigenous people keep speaking about these same places in very different ways, foregrounding relationships, holding nature and society together, holding humans and the environment together. And it's not a messy, undifferentiated holism. It's actually a really sophisticated, fine-grained way of understanding where we all are and what matters, by following the connections, which relationships are important and why. So water is really important. So fresh water is, you know, given huge importance in, you know, Indigenous law and knowledge. I'll have to refer you to other work if you want to follow up on that. But here we're talking about fire, and fire is also incredibly important, as Victor was talking about, and Vanessa. And here I want to talk about Gwen, talking about relationships, because this is all about everything in relation. And I will just, so Gwen is actually a professor at Western Sydney University. Here we go with Gwen.
Before I go any further though, we need the foundation of this particular presentation, and that is the work that's centering the notion of Indigenous relatedness. Now, Indigenous relatedness is not about simple family connections. It's not about simple kinship connections. It's not about what country we supposedly own or not. It is much, much more than this. It is our relationships with our ancestors, our country, all the entities on country, the spirits that pass on the messages of country and the lessons of country, our stories. It is how we are with country. It is an immensely complicated construct, but it is an exceptionally important way to understand, I would argue, the events of the Appin massacre itself.
And I encourage you to go and listen to him speaking about the Appin massacre on his country on this website. But what he's foregrounding is similar to Laurentianum, is relatedness, drawing on a really different knowledge tradition that acknowledges that country, as Lauren said earlier, that country has agency, that is powerful, a powerful force. And this is not the kind of humans as mammals, drinking fresh water in the environment that is sometimes understood as humanity's relationship with the environment. In this perspective, environment has law and knowledge too. Humans are not the only ones who can speak and act. And it's has been called interbeing ethical relationality. It's about ethical relationships and responsibilities as within lively worlds with country. And it's really, really important because it connects us to where we already are within country, within Indigenous country. And so I use this slide to just kind of say, with this big idea of the environment, it's, often that we as humans are external and looking at it. Whereas the in understanding country is to understand where we already are within the law and knowledge that arises out of country. And so it's a shift. And so from the connected perspective, we are learning about country with country rather than observing nature externally. And it's really important in terms of one of the things I flagged in my abstract is this is not just this very different way of understanding the world, which is very old compared to the more recent idea of the environment, is consequential for how knowledge is organised and taught in Australian society, and including the arrangement, how it affects the arrangement of our government departments. And if we turn to the natural hazard context, natural hazard, the people who work in this space are well aware that nature is powerful and has an agency that eclipses human agency because of their experiences working with these powerful forces. But the evidence they get from the university sector is focused on the environment, an environment which excludes humanity, whereas I've skipped ahead here, whereas the natural hazard sector knows about the hazard, which is the flood or the bushfire, but they are focused on the risk, which is what's it affecting that matters to human values. And so they have a really strong idea about everything being together, because when the hazard comes, it's really obvious how everything is related. There's no separating out nature and society at all. But the evidence they get, it's the natural, is from the natural science traditions, very important evidence about predicting hazards, but not about the values and what matters. And this leads me to the problem with this is that, as scientists have been saying also for decades, is that it disables our capacity to respond to the environment. If it's separate, it's elsewhere. And we saw this in the lead up to the fires, as the Department of Environment lost a lot of funding around national park management, because they were kind of seen as places that weren't very important. Instead, we need to rethread nature and society, not just in how we know the world, but also in how Western knowledge is arranged in the university. And so I realise I've taken you on a rather long walk here with humanities thought leadership that has learned from Indigenous peoples' knowledge systems. And so what I'm doing as an ally is listening to those knowledge systems and then interpreting them with my inheritance and the expertise I see around myself in the academy. And so we need to rethread Western knowledge, and that is the two steps. The first one, resituating humans within nature, which I've already talked about, and the second one is returning nature to cultural and ethical domains, which is the one that really struggles with in Western thinking, because it is so different to this really big idea of the environment, which underscores a lot of how knowledge is organised in the academy. And we see that in the inquiry responses. They are the bits that are easy to hear are being heard, whereas this kind of idea of the separate nature continues. And I've just got here a paper here by Jason Sharples and colleagues about natural hazard, about extreme bushfires. So the scientists predicted, that we were going to get these extreme bushfires. This one's from 2016, because of climate change, which makes everything, it's like climate on steroids, to quote the late great Will Steffen. Everything's more extreme, and we really saw that in 2019. What kind of shocked me was I collaborate with Jason on occasion, and he had been predicting this, and then it happened, and it was really quite shocking how the importance of this work is not brought to the foreground. And it's my argument that that's because we are not foregrounding the land or country. And so just to sum up here on my last slide, so what I've shared with you today is a meeting place of two very different cultures and knowledge traditions that are now living together and working together and using the same language and the same terms, but with very different ideas. And we can only, I have only been able to hear what Indigenous leaders are saying by going to my own knowledge traditions and thinking, well, why did I think that way? And unpacking the steps that I took that had been taken before I was born to separate the environment out as no longer a life force that nurtures our lives and which we have reciprocal responsibilities to, which you will find those traditions if you go back long enough in my Anglo culture. Instead, instead I was taught something else and was undergraduate and postgraduate at university. It's a really big idea, but we can't move forward with foregrounding country without unpacking this idea, because otherwise, when the headlines come around again and say, oh, what about Indigenous fire management? It ends up being a cool burning technique that's recognised as being different and is supported by supporting Indigenous people to go and do cultural burns on their own, on certain land tenures, rather than understanding that it's a reframing of where humanity stands in relation to the world, country, and the consequences for establishing our risk hierarchy, flipping it's on its head, basically, to foreground country. And, it was just a few weeks after these fires that the global pandemic hit, and the headlines, it all stopped. The interest stopped. Everything stopped. And it was extraordinary, because it was a moment when we could have really, really, it was so horrific what happened, but we could have really responded to it. But instead, there was a big pivot around the global pandemic, which, yes, is important, but climate change and country is so much more important. And I'm going to end it there. So thank you for listening. And we've got 12 minutes for questions. But I'd like to just please acknowledge any Indigenous people in the audience first and throw to them first for responses. Thanks.
Thanks, Jessica. Open for questions.
I'm just having a look to see if Dean made it. No, and also my colleagues, my colleague Bayami sends his apologies as well. They're actually having a cultural burning meeting today with the New South Wales government.
I have a question, Jessica. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So my question is about, there's obviously, you talked about how the reasons for cultural burning are different than the reasons that we might undertake cultural burning. So I kind of have two questions about, one is, how do you propose that we integrate cultural burning into existing regimes, existing approaches, without just leveraging it for our own ends? How might that happen practically? Because there's such a mismatch between the two things, and it also, there's this danger of co-opting. And I guess that's the other bit of, like, what do you see as some of the if people really took this seriously, as it seems like there's an increasing interest in it, how would you sort of integrate it within the existing system? Like, what is the pathway to do that without just making it something that we're doing for our own ends and for our own objectives and on our own terms?
Yeah, that's the really big thing. And that's why I prioritised power as an issue in this talk. So to keep returning to this sort of clash of two different ways of living in Australia, and the kind of the power asymmetries that are present today with the absence of Indigenous voices and thinking in the mainstream, you know, and so that does make the co-option risks really high. And so that's why if you listen to Indigenous leaders, they prioritise Indigenous leadership. So having Indigenous people in the room and funded to be there. Also funding Indigenous knowledge institutions. So that means funding Indigenous people to be on country, because country is where knowledge is from, and to be teaching on country. And funding Indigenous governance institutions. So there's massive power asymmetries currently. It is changing. Most of Australia's being recognised as, you know, Indigenous title, but without funding streams to accompany that. So probably needs to have some of the suggestions that come up is changes to how the federal tax system to fund Indigenous governance and organisations. And so your next question, and so that's what Indigenous leaders are saying. Of course, there's also opportunities for doing it in partnership with Indigenous leaders. And then there's the risk of co-option, which is, it's really clear that it's happening around coal burning or ecological burns, which, you know, is kind of a new idea around burning for habitat and species protection. And Indigenous people just see it as, well, you've learnt from our cultural burns and here you are now taking, just going to call it an ecological burn, and then we will still be, you're still not hearing that this very message that our lives, you know, that we neglect country at our peril. You know, Indigenous leadership would not have spent 70 years deciding to respond to climate change, you know, because no cultural burn is going to influence climate change. It's these really, really big ideas. And the term integration itself is, Indigenous leaders will say integrated into what, you know, and because if it's integrated into that idea of the environment as whether it's wilderness, whether it's ecological services, whether it's natural resources, but whatever it is, it's separate to people. It doesn't have agency. There's no ethical relationships. There's no law or knowledge, etc., etc. If we stay with that kind of thinking, where was I going with that? Yeah, so that integrates it into that. Yeah, so integrated into what? You want to be integrated into that, because that's not what Indigenous people are talking about. And it really requires natural science advocates to step back, step up and walk alongside Indigenous leaders, because it's the natural sciences that have the authority to speak for the environment in Australia.
Jessica, there is a question in waiting.
Neil?
Neil
Oh,
has
Nick
raised.
Gill.
Yeah, hi Jessica.
Hi, Nick.
How you doing?
Good.
Thanks for that. Really interesting stuff. As you know, I'm dipping my toe back in the bushfire water, so to speak. So it was really interesting to hear you talk. You might have actually sort of started to, or at least answered my question in part, because when often in talk of cultural burn, there's always talk of two ways of doing things, you know, the Indigenous way, cultural burning, and then the Western way. But I've always felt slightly uncomfortable that characterising it such a binary way is problematic. And you sort of got it a bit then, in that we referred to on the Western side of things, talking about framing things in terms of ecology and ecological burns. And of course, that still comes from the same kind of ontology that you're critically engaging with. But I guess I just wonder, my question was going to be, to what extent is there some kind of engagement between more thoughtful non-Indigenous ways of knowing and understanding fire and risk and so on. And I was thinking of that ecological tradition in Australia, which has been kicking around for a long time, and which, you know, ecologists, environmental organisations and so on have been promoting more nuanced ways of dealing with fire and using fire in the Australian landscapes for a long time. Now, you've partly addressed it in a particular way, but maybe I should, I don't know, reframe my question in a way that is there something in that ecological thinking and the sort of positions that have been advanced from organisations and groups and people interested in fire in more subtle and more nuanced kinds of ways? Is there a thoughtfulness, at least a thoughtfulness in that way of thinking about fire, even if it does come from a scientific framework? Is there something valuable in that, and how is that being taken into the sort of the work that you're involved in the rollout of cultural burning and so on and so forth?
Yeah, hi, thanks Nick, thanks for your question too. Absolutely. So this is a great follow on from Sarah's question, because actually Indigenous, it's extraordinary when you I just think of Emma Lee from Tasmania. When we were at a meeting, she was saying, of course you're all welcome here in country, you know, very expressing that, you know, everyone is being held here in country. The ecological sensitivity to nature is within country. So integrated into what actually we are already in country. We just need to find ourselves. We all need to find ourselves here where we already are. And we're seeing a lot of, so for example, in Victoria, the state report response to the inquiry had the usual, you know, wildlife and habitat recovery kind of ecology thinking. But at the very top, it says Indigenous leadership. So this Indigenous leadership for wildlife and habitat recovery. And so there's a recognition of Indigenous leadership, and then people are figuring out how to do it on country. And that was a huge thing during the bushfires, is that there were all these voices going, we've been doing it here, we've been doing it there, we can do it. And the more, you know, people without those experiences were having to respond to that and put it in the terms of reference, because it was such a social thing. So absolutely, there's a massive place for care for the natural world. It's just, we all have to kind of find our way towards each other through the crazy recent knowledge systems that were created in the 20th century and now have shown to really have been fantastic in so many ways, but just should not be as important as they've been placed. Yeah, we need to go back to the importance placed on ethics and values and responsibilities. So rather than just observational knowledge, which is important, but it's only part of the picture. Thanks, Nick. And a question from Bron Brown.
Oh, hi. Sorry, my name's Kate Brown. That's my computer. I'm a Gamilaroi woman. I'm working in the cultural science space. And what I think I find really challenging is that, so we're doing sort of community engagement and stakeholder mapping and all that sort of stuff, great to achieve all these environmental outcomes. But it's that general conception that country isn't considered a stakeholder in our programs, and trying to explain that to people that come from like engineers or very I guess reductionist science, which kind of likes to, and I understand why, likes to put things in one little box. So if you've got any tips for explaining those concepts to scientists for me.
Oh yeah, thanks, Kate. Kind of my life's work, and I'm being taught, like I'm a junior being taught by the elders from along the river. I think being on country and doing things on country and being taught on country is just a really important way to do it. And the scientists are being required to engage with Indigenous people as a standard thing now. It's becoming a standard thing in kind of funding bodies like the National Environmental Science Program. So I actually think that, and yeah, I actually think this is where there's going to be this is where a lot of very interesting things are already happening. I've just written about it in relation to what's going on in the ACT, where scientists, they're able to treat Indigenous knowledge more respectfully, but absolutely that idea that country has agency really struggles because the idea of the environment is not just separate from humanity, but it's hyper separated. So that what is nature cannot be human, and to combine them is a nonsense. So to say that the tree can speak, that only humans have the capacity to speak, but yet there's so much interesting scientific work around the language of plants and so on and so forth. I just kind of hang out for generational change, but it is happening. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I even find myself sometimes doing that too, like sort of, feeling, thinking and being on country, and then sort of having to stop the science part of my brain going, hang on, can we test this? Can we monitor it? So we're all sort of in that learning journey together. And it is really exciting. There are a lot of great changes, but it is also something that we're all in this Western education system indoctrinated into thinking. So it really is, as you say, about changing our ways of thinking and being on country and experiencing.
Yeah, it's just going to happen. The moral, political, legal argument is so, it can't be, it was tried to be hidden. People tried to pretend it wasn't happening, and they can't, it's just, it's the genie's out of the bottle. And then once you've got that respect, okay, well, now listen.
Yep.
That's my thought. But thank you so much for coming today.
Cool. Thanks, Jessica.
Your information, they got your details, so they can ask questions if they have. And we are expect to get this recording as soon as possible up on the website. And thanks, Jessica. That was really interesting and informative. I learned a lot. So just a round of applause to Jessica.
Thank you, everyone. And thanks, Badra and Emma.